All right, so this is just a recap of the major battles of the Civil War. As we went through the battle simulations in class, this is just kind of help reinforce some of the major aspects of each of those key battles. So, the first conflict of the war, not necessarily categorized as a battle, is the incident at Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. So, at this point, Fort Sumter had been a Union fort off the coast of Charleston, which is major harbor in the state of South Carolina. The Confederacy wanted the fort. They had issued a summons to Abraham Lincoln and the Union government to have their troops removed from that fort since they felt it belonged to South Carolina and such the Confederacy. Lincoln gave the orders for General Anderson, who was who was commanding Fort Sumter, to hold fire, but to not give up the fort. He was going to be sending supplies. And as we know, Lincoln gave warning to the governor of South Carolina that he was going to resupply the troops and General Anderson at Fort Sumter. So the Confederacy felt forced to attack. They were trying to gain control of multiple forts, and so they attacked Fort Sumter. The goal was to get those supplies and ammunition and, confiscate those and bring them into the Union Army. This battle is going to take about 34 hours. No one was killed. But the Union Army is going to surrender the fort. And so this is a huge morale booster for the Confederacy and seen as their first major victory. And ultimately, this is going to be the beginning of the war. So here is an image of the attack at Fort Sumter. So similar images like this were published in newspapers, both in the Confederacy and throughout the Union. For those of you who are in Miss Yetson's class, you guys want to get your nation divided map that you had completed, and it looks like this because you're going to be adding the battles to your map. So off the coast of South Carolina, you can put a little star and put the label of Fort Sumter. Now, this you guys don't really need to take notes on. This is just a recap briefly for you, the advantages and disadvantages on both sides. So after the conflict of Fort Sumter, both sides, the North and the South, are going to start taking recruits. They're going to start building up their armies, gathering supplies and resources for potential battle and combat. So the Union was favored because they had more resources, they had more factories, more railroads to be able to transport goods and troops. Surprisingly, they also had better agriculture in regards to more livestock, more wheat, more corn to be able to feed their troops. So greater food production, which is something that we typically associate with the agricultural South. The South, cotton was earning a lot of money on the world market, so they were hoping to continue to make money, and that means they have great military leadership under the leadership of people like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Because of that strong military tradition and that early victory with being able to conquer Fort Sumter, the morale is high. They are feeling confident that they're going to win. And so they have motivated soldiers, of course, defending their homeland, because majority of the war will be fought in the Confederate or Southern Territory. So understanding the strategy for the war. The Union had to create a game plan. How were they going to force the Confederacy to surrender to bring them back into the Union? Because remember, this is Abraham Lincoln's ultimate goal, is to keep the Union together. So the Union has three major components to their plan. The first component is the Union Navy. This is something that the Confederacy lacked. Was a strong navy to combat against the Union Navy. So they're going to use that to their advantage. They're going to form a blockade around those southern ports because we just said a major advantage of the Confederacy was their ability to make money off their cotton trade in their international markets. So if they can't sell their cotton abroad, they're not going to be able to bring in any money, which wars are expensive. You need an income and a steady flow of currency to be able to fund the war. The second component to the Union plan is to gain control of the Mississippi. If you look back at your maps, okay, or if you take a look at a map, the Mississippi River essentially cuts the Confederacy in half. And so they need to maintain control of the Mississippi River to keep the Confederacy intact. Plus, the South doesn't have a lot of railroads. They're reliant on their river systems, and the Mississippi River is their main mode of transportation. So that's definitely going to be a target by the Union Army. And then, of course, like in any war, it is to capture the capital. So the Union wants to hopefully surround the Confederacy with the blockade, cut off their supplies and resources, cut them in half with controlling the Mississippi, and then gradually get closer and closer to Richmond. This was going to take time. This was not a quick approach to victory. And this is where this plan got nicknamed the Anaconda Plan, because you're surrounding your enemy and slowly constricting, cutting off supplies and resources and essentially their livelihood, forcing them to surrender. The South didn't really have that great of a strategy. They didn't have an elaborate plan like the Union. Their main system was defense. They were defending their homeland. They did not want to engage in battle with the Union. They really just wanted to be left on their own to form their own country. And so they felt that their best war strategy was to defend the homeland. One aspect of the Civil War that we're going to see used primarily by the Union Army, but is going to be used by both, is the concept of total war. Total war brings the war not only to the soldiers and to the battlefield, but to the civilian population and to the home front as well. Total war, when going through a region, would be destroying all crops, all infrastructure, all resources, anything that could be used to support the enemy. This is going to be heavily used by William Tecumseh Sherman, as we'll see his march to the sea and march through Georgia, that he destroys all livestock. You can see here they're tearing up railroads, burning of houses and buildings and crops and resources to essentially weaken not only the army, but weaken the morale, break the morale of the civilian population, to the point that wives and children who feel abandoned and worried and don't know what to do with the destroyed home and farm are going to start writing letters to their fathers and to their husbands, begging them to come home and to end the war so that they can try to piece what they have left back together. We will see some new technology in regards to this war. So we talked about the mini bullet that is kind of shaped like a cone, which is going to be far more accurate than the traditional musket ball that we had seen. We're also going to see the introduction of the ironclads. So they had just been recently developed. This is the precursor to submarines and other forms of battleships that will be used in the world wars and abroad. So the ironclad were first used within the Civil War, and you can see, the shape of the steamboats given like a suit of armor, essentially. And so they're very heavy, but they would navigate the rivers to try to protect them. The Union would use the ironclad to try to capture the rivers, and the Confederacy is going to use them to try to defend. So this brings us to our first, quote, battle of the Civil War. So organized battle and conflict. Some time has passed. Fort Sumter was in April of 1861, April 12th. We are now in July. So in that or about 3 month time period, both sides have built up their armies, and both armies were itching to go to war or to go to battle to see who was going to, defeat the other. So this first battle is going to take place in Virginia, not far from where we are, known as the Battle of Manassas, or to some known as the Battle of Bull Run. So what we discover at this battle is both armies are very inexperienced. They're what we would call green soldiers. They're young. They are naive to what war is going to look like. It's a seesaw battle. There's no one decisive side kind of taking the lead. The Union would advance, and then the Confederacy would advance. Some takeaways from this battle is Thomas Jackson leading a regiment of the Confederate Army. This is where he gets his nickname known as Stonewall, because he encouraged the Confederates not to retreat and help lead them to a Confederate victory. The Union Army is going to retreat, and so this is, again, another morale booster for the Confederacy. So the Confederates couldn't, chase them on the run, but still, a morale booster that, once again, we defeated you at Fort Sumter. We've now defeated you at the Battle of Manassas. So it just keeps feeding their confidence and their support for the war. And so here we've got a picture of the battle taking place up around here. This is to demonstrate the spectators. So there were individuals who packed picnic lunches and came in carriages to watch the battle commence. Again, showing how naive really the whole society was about the concept of war. Their picnic was cut short as those troops started to retreat. They started to go right through where those picnickers were located. And so many are going to scramble into their carriages and on their horses to flee the scene. So again, those of you in Miss Edson's class, you want to update your nation divided map. So you can put a star in the northern part of Virginia and label that as the Battle of Manassas. So we've been talking a lot about what's been happening on the East Coast, the blockade by the Union Navy, the Confederate victory at Fort Sumter, and the Confederate victory at the Battle of Manassas. But remember, the second part of the Anaconda Plan, the Union's plan of attack, was to capture the Mississippi. So there is going to be some fighting in the western part of the Confederacy and of the country. So April 6th through 7th of 1862, so we're a year into fighting, and Ulysses S. Grant is leading his regiment of troops in the western part of Tennessee. It is his goal to cross into the state of Mississippi to be able to get closer to capture the Mississippi River, to gain control and cut the Confederacy in half. General Johnson of the Confederacy is going to conduct an ambush attack because he knows his troops are outnumbered by that of the local Union troops that are camped there in a little sleepy town called Shiloh. There's a church nearby called Shiloh Church. That's where the battle gets its name. So the Confederates conduct an ambush attack early in the morning, trying to get the Union Army off, caught off guard. To the point that that would maybe give them an upper hand in regards to the battle. Ulysses S. Grant and his regiment were, maybe a couple miles out. They heard the shots fired and they quickly scrambled to come and become a reinforcement. Ulysses S. Grant is going to counterattack. General Johnson actually was fatally wounded and is going to be replaced by General Beauregard. So Beauregard is trying to lead the attack to defeat the Union forces. But the fact that Ulysses S. Grant comes with reinforcements, and then we will have another set of troops, General Buell of the Union Army is going to send reinforcements from Ohio to help Grant. They are going to be able to defeat the Confederacy. And so this is just proving that they are getting closer and closer to capturing and gaining control of the Mississippi River. So the Battle of Shiloh is considered a Union victory. So we're going to see a lot of Union victory in the West, where the Confederacy is getting more victory in the East. So just kind of a painting image of the Battle of Shiloh. And again, the significance of the waterways, the rivers. That was what was at stake for the Battle of Shiloh. So the southwestern part of Tennessee, just at the northern part of the state of Mississippi. Okay, so a couple months after the Union victory at the Battle of Shiloh, Lincoln was hoping for a major victory in the East. He knew he needed to do something to kind of motivate the Union Army, particularly the Army of the Potomac in the East. And so he was looking to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which is going to free slaves only in those territories that are rebelling. But he wanted to issue the document after a major Union victory. So we're starting to get into the setting of fall, and it's harvest season in September of 1862. Antietam is close to Sharpsburg, Maryland. And so Lee's thought was to get the Union troops out of the Confederacy, to get them particularly out of Virginia, to allow the Virginia farmers to harvest their crops, particularly wheat and rice and whatever corn they had planted, to be able to feed the Confederate troops. They didn't want Union soldiers in there, taking the food and or burning the fields and destroying the crop. So Robert E. Lee kind of goes on the offensive, and he crosses over from the Confederate side into the border state of Maryland to engage in battle with General George McClellan. It's also Robert E. Lee's thought that perhaps they could feed off of the Union Army's food resources within the state of Maryland. So be able to use their livestock or obtain their wheat or corn to help feed his troops. So at this point, it's a lot about food. As General McClellan engages in battle with Robert E. Lee, they are going to suffer major casualties. Approximately 26,000 soldiers were killed at the Battle of Antietam. This is one day. So while it says bloodiest battle of the war, you should make note it's the bloodiest single day battle of the war. There will be more casualties at the Battle of Gettysburg. McClellan kind of stood up to Lee. He was suffering heavy casualties, though. The Union suffered more casualties than the Confederacy, but Robert E. Lee was forced to retreat. He could not maintain the ground there in Antietam, so he sought refuge, crossing back into Virginia. Now, this is what's going to get McClellan in trouble, is Lee is on the run, and it's very rare that Robert E. Lee was in the retreat or on the run. And if McClellan had been more aggressive and thought about the bigger picture, he would have pursued Robert E. Lee because he could have destroyed major numbers of Lee's army to the point that it may have shortened the war overall. But McClellan felt that he had suffered enough casualties on the Union Army that he no longer needed to put his army in harm's way. And so this is eventually going to cost McClellan his job because Lincoln needed someone to be more aggressive against Robert E. Lee. So by November of 1862, McClellan's going to be fired as the head general of the Army of the Potomac. And so so looking at this, the situation of Antietam, it's not a Union victory, nor is it a Confederate victory. It's pretty much inconclusive because both sides suffered major casualties and major losses. And so this is an image of a reenactment of the Battle of Antietam. Reenactment scene for the Civil War is definitely a popular scene. There are a lot of individuals who reenact multiple battles of the Civil War. So again, on your map, up in Maryland, you want to put a star for the Battle of Antietam. So even though the Battle of Antietam is not classified as an overall victory or decisive victory for the Union, Lincoln felt it was enough for him to be able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So as we know, after the Battle of Antietam, 5 days later is when Abraham Lincoln will issue his introductory Emancipation Proclamation, which is going to free all slaves in territories that are in rebellion against the United States. So he had to be very strategic about how he freed these individuals because he was trying to keep the border states on the side of the Union. So it's very important to see how he emphasized that the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in territories of rebellion. And as we'll also see, the only way, of course, that was going to be enforced were if those slaves got to Union troops. So this is, also kind of an internal motivation. Lincoln is trying to stir some rebellion amongst the slave populations of the South to try to get to the Union Army so that they're able to obtain and be recognized as free individuals. And so now this is going to start to motivate the Union Army. They have something to fight for. They're fighting to abolish the institution of slavery. Whether or not they saw African Americans as their equals was not relevant to them at this time. They were going to take something away from the South. And by the late 1862, a solid year into the war, people are starting to realize this is not going to be the quick war or conflict that they had anticipated when it started. It was starting to become long, drawn out. So after the winter of 1862, we're going to emerge into the spring and summer. In the summer of 1863, we are going to have what is considered the turning point of the war with the Battle of Gettysburg. By this point, the Confederacy were starting to feel the, the lack of supplies, the lack of money. They were starting to lose morale as the war dragged on. They needed a boost. Particularly, they needed support of foreign countries. With the lack of cotton sales, it's definitely going to have an economic impact on Great Britain and France. And so the Confederacy was hoping to use their economic relationship as a means to create a political relationship where Great Britain and France would recognize the sovereignty of the Confederate States of America and also potentially provide money and financial support to them throughout this war. But the European countries were hesitant because they hadn't seen the Confederacy win a decisive victory. And so this is what's going to encourage Robert E. Lee to abandon the defensive and go on the offensive, to actually go into Union territory and try to defeat them on their own turf. So in July of 1863, Robert E. Lee and his army had marched into a sleepy little place of Pennsylvania known as Gettysburg. Gettysburg wasn't really their ideal destination for a battle. A lot of the Confederate soldiers had gone into the town of Gettysburg because there was a rumor of shoes. And, the Confederacy was so low on supplies that many soldiers needed a new pair of boots. I mean, they're marching 10 to 15, maybe even 20 miles a day. Their feet were sore, the soles of their shoes were worn out, and that's if they had shoes at all. So the prospect of getting new boots was something that's going to draw the Confederacy into the town of Gettysburg. So wasn't initially a planned battle. So the Confederates are marching north to get those supplies. The battle, as we see, is going to take place over 3 days. The Union has the advantage because they had control of the high ground. That's military 101. You want to have control of the high ground so that you can see out across to your enemy and be able to strategize how you're going to be able to defend yourselves. Both sides are going to have staggering losses. The Battle of Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle of the war. General Lee is going to be forced to retreat to salvage whatever he has left of the Northern Virginia Army. And this is considered the turning point of the war because this is Robert E. Lee's last attempt of trying to seize land in the Union territory. He's not going to try to invade the North again. He's going to remain on the defensive. So this was a clear Union victory. And this is where things start to turn around for the Union, where they're going to start to become more victorious and more aggressive, particularly on the East Coast. So again, just another image of the Battle of Gettysburg. And on your map in the state of Pennsylvania, you can add the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, happening simultaneously as the battle in Gettysburg, which is considered the turning point in the war, we're also going to have another major victory in the West. So we haven't talked about the West in a while. We've been focusing on the East. Well, Ulysses S. Grant has been gaining ground in the West. He's also gained the nickname the Butcher because he showed very little regard for the Union soldiers' lives. He didn't care about casualty numbers because he knew the Union could replenish them. He cared about getting that victory. So the Battle of Vicksburg is going to take place. Vicksburg was in the state of Mississippi, close to the Mississippi River. And so Grant realized if he could get control of Vicksburg, this would pretty much give him control of the Mississippi River, which in turn would cut the Confederacy in half. So Grant laid siege to the city. He is going to surround them and pretty much form a blockade to starve them out. The Confederate troops were running so low on supplies that if you were a Confederate soldier who was wounded, you were denied food. Only those who were capable and able to fight were fed. And so the Confederate soldiers started looking at their commander saying, look, if you can't beat us, then we need to surrender. And so July 4th, kind of ironically, American Independence Day, is when the city of Vicksburg is going to fall. And Gettysburg ended July 3rd of 1863. So two major Union victories, turning things around in the East and essentially gaining control of the Mississippi River of the West. So the blockade is working. They've gotten control of the Mississippi River. So they only now need to focus on the third component of the Anaconda Plan, which is to capture the capital city of Richmond. So on your map for Vicksburg, right there on the coast of the Mississippi River, close to Louisiana, is where the Battle of Vicksburg took place. Now, a few days after the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln is going to give an address that is forever going to change our reference to the United States. The Gettysburg Address was probably the most famous speech that was given by a U.S. president. And it really wasn't even meant to be a great speech. It was only 10 lines. It was very short. Lincoln wrote it on the train ride up to Gettysburg. He was dedicating the Gettysburg Cemetery, okay, where Union troops had been buried. And, it didn't get the notoriety at the time that the speech was given to the way what we will see it today. Lincoln didn't even really want to give a speech. He had a terrible cold at the time and wasn't really feeling up to it, but he felt compelled to speak. And the main takeaway from the Gettysburg Address is how he references the United States. Up until this point, if anybody referenced the country, they would say the United States are. And so that R is plural. It's referring to the multiple states, thinking about, comprising all these states to make up the United States. Where Lincoln, when he's referencing the country as a whole, he's kind of reinforcing with the Gettysburg Address what is so significant, that this is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and hope that it will never perish from the earth, that the Union would survive. And from that point on, he referred to the United States not as the United States are, but instead the United States is. So a singular unit, a whole nation. That doesn't seem, very important to us at this time, but, today that's how we refer to it. The United States is. But that was a pivotal shift in thinking, as he started to refer to the country as one whole unit, which, as we know, was his main goal overall. Well, after the victories of Vicksburg, Ulysses S. Grant is going to be summoned by President Lincoln to become the general and chief of the Army of the Potomac, which was the main army to take on Robert E. Lee. He needed someone who was aggressive like Grant to put the pressure on Robert E. Lee. So Grant had to choose someone to continue to lead the troops in command in the West, and he selected William Tecumseh Sherman, kind of considered his right-hand man. So Grant appoints Sherman to lead the armies in Mississippi. So he leaves a small reinforcement to maintain control of Vicksburg and control of the Mississippi River. But then Sherman marches. He takes his troops and he marches from Mississippi up through Tennessee, pretty much over to Georgia. He wants to get to the coastline and then move up the coast to Virginia to get that third and final component of the Anaconda Plan, capture the capital city of Richmond. Sherman also believed in the concept of total war. So he took the war to the people. As his troops marched to the coast, they destroyed everything. They, blew up railroads, twisted the remains, they burned fields, they burned down houses. There were attacks on civilian population. They slaughtered livestock and left them, in the fields to rot. Pretty much try to break the morale of the Southern people and the civilian population to force them to surrender. And so he's not going to be very popular. He was particularly harsh in Atlanta, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, so that by the time he got to North Carolina and even emerged into Virginia, he kind of felt at that point the war was over. So they didn't sustain the same damage that Georgia and South Carolina had sustained. And so images here, just like we had seen before, images of that total war. So the complete destruction of buildings, homes, railroads, lands, anything in sight. And so this brings us to the end of the war with the situation of Appomattox Courthouse. By April of 1865, Robert E. Lee was understanding his defeat. Grant had put the pressure on Lee at every battle or encounter that they had. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but Grant could continue to replenish his troops where the Confederacy could not. So by April of 1865, the Confederate troops were surrounded by the Union Army. They met at Appomattox Courthouse. And Lee agrees to the surrender terms by the Union Army. President Lincoln told Grant to not arrest Robert E. Lee and to not to punish the leadership or the troops. He says to seize the weapons, seize like the sabers and the guns of the officers, but essentially to allow the Confederate infantry to just go home. Take some food and stuff with them and return to their homes without the fear of being labeled as a traitor or potentially being put on trial. So they're provided rations and money to be able to go home. Grant paroled some of the Confederate soldiers. So, that is paroled again, is the ability to forgive them. So they're again not being convicted of or arrested on crimes of treason. And so Lee thought that these were acceptable terms. Robert E. Lee is going to encourage the rest of the Confederacy to accept these terms and to accept defeat. In Northern Virginia, they kind of felt the defeat. They had felt the destruction. And with the army surrendering, they felt that defeat. But in parts of the Deep South, like Mississippi and Alabama, or even parts of Louisiana, they didn't feel the defeat because the Union Army didn't have a strong presence there. They more so took it as, okay, well, we've just agreed to stop fighting, but they never felt defeated. And that feeling is going to be quite significant when we talk about the Reconstruction policies that are going to be implemented to try to bring the country back together. So this is a painting created to demonstrate what the meeting between the two generals might have looked like to negotiate the surrender. And so the last component here to add to your map and kind of the central part of Virginia, you want to add Appomattox Court.